Well, the financial collapse of 2008 ushered in a new season for investors. The high spend, high growth days of 1982 through 2007 are gone, and investors must now think differently. So let me put it this way. Let's say you were planning a trip to Chicago in January, and you knew that the average annual temperature was 50 degrees. Would you pack for 50-degree weather in January? No, of course you wouldn't, because you would know that's very unlikely. You would pack for a typical cold, windy Chicago winter day. Yet most investors have prepared their portfolio for the average market temperature without regard to season, and many are risking financial frostbite as a result. Now, many investors, and I include professional advisors in this category, continue to invest as if 1982 through 2007 was typical market behavior and that the last 3 years were just a bump in the road back to normal. And this is understandable because it's easy to be deceived into believing a market pattern is normal if it lasts long enough, but the only thing normal about markets are that seasons change with time. And changing seasons significantly impact investors because strategies that work so well in one season may not work at all in another. But this doesn't mean that investors are doomed to fail. It simply means they must think differently. So why have the seasons changed? Well, the answer is easy. We spent more than we could afford for 27 years, and that ended in 2008. And now it's payback time. And when you're forced to pay back debt, it means you have less money to spend and invest. Now, I want you to stay with me here because I need to just quickly review a couple economic concepts that are going to be critical to understand what I'm going to talk about here when I refer to the big picture. Now, the first of those concepts is every dollar we spend becomes income to another. So, for example, if you buy a McDonald's hamburger for $1, part of that dollar goes to the farmer who raised the cow. Part of that dollar goes to the employee who grilled the burger. And part of that dollar goes to the McDonald's shareholder as corporate profit. So since corporate profits are a form of income, they cannot sustainably grow unless spending is growing. And remember that it is ultimately growing corporate profits that make stocks more valuable. Now, the second concept I want to review is GDP. It stands for Gross Domestic Product, and something I think we've all at least heard of at some point in our lives. Gross domestic product is simply the most popular measure of total spending in an economy. It's calculated by adding together all the spending by the private sector, which is businesses and individuals, all the spending by the government, and net exports, which is just the amount of stuff we've sold to other countries minus the amount of stuff we bought from them. Now, I want to talk about each of these three components so you can see where future spending growth and therefore economic growth might come from. And I'm going to start with the first component, the private sector. Now, prior to 2008, we massively increased our borrowing and spending. And towards the end of the period, you had millions of people more or less using their homes as piggy banks. But the more we borrowed and spent, the more the economy grew. So to put this in perspective, let's say that you earned $100,000 and you decided that wasn't enough, you wanted to live the high life, so you ran up credit card bills of $20,000 a year. For a glorious period of time, you could live as if you made $120,000. However, when the bill came due, not only could you not spend that extra $20,000, you may only be able to spend $80,000 of your original income because part of that will be going to reduce debt. So we can't live beyond our means forever. Now, in 2008, this is really what happened to the private sector. The bill collector came knocking at the door, and living beyond our means was no longer an option. It is now time to reduce our debts. Now, the good news here is the private sector has since made some progress towards reducing debt. The bad news is we still have a long ways to go. So this means that it's going to be very difficult for the private sector to meaningfully contribute to economic growth in the years ahead. Now, the second component of GDP is government spending. If the private sector can't do it, could it be Uncle Sam that steps in and picks up the tab? Well, this is really what's happened here since 2008, is governments have run massive deficits in order to compensate for reduced private sector spending. But this too is unsustainable, and you're seeing it now. Lenders are drawing the line, and we're reaching our borrowing limits. So with constituents up in arms, it's going to be very difficult for governments to continue spending, and they must too tighten their belts in the years ahead. So this leaves the third component of GDP, which is net exports. If governments can't do it and the private sector can't do it, could it be exports to rapidly growing countries like China and India and Brazil that save the day? Well, this certainly offers a ray of hope, but the problem is that many other countries have the same game plan, and that is to export their way to prosperity. But someone must import more than they export in order for the math to work. So while net exports may generate some growth in the years ahead, they're going to be hard-pressed to carry the burden on their own. Now, I focused mostly on debt and deficits so far, but there's many other hurdles that need to be jumped in order to achieve sustainable economic growth. So just to name a few others, demographic trends, they've turned from favorable to unfavorable as baby boomers have reached retirement age. The bill for unfunded Medicare and Medicaid promises has now come due. Savings rates are low, and future income is more likely to be saved than spent in the years ahead. Interest rates are near all-time lows, and stimulating more borrowing and spending with lower interest rates is no longer an option. Now, taxes, they were lowered in the mid-'80s, they were lowered again in the early 2000s. Given all these debt and deficit issues I've been talking about, the next direction for taxes is most likely to be up. Now, I could go on here, but I think you're getting the idea. Duplicating past growth rates is going to be very difficult in the years ahead. So while it's important to understand the reasons growth might be challenged, what investors really want to know is how is it going to affect the markets? Now, in simple terms, there's really three possible outcomes. There's Goldilocks, muddle through, and three bears. So let me just comment briefly on each of these. Now, Goldilocks would be a scenario where all these obstacles in the path of growth that we've discussed are overcome, and market returns are more in line with those experienced in recent decades. Now, Goldilocks is certainly a possible outcome and shouldn't be dismissed by investors. However, with all the challenges we've talked about, it does not appear to be the most likely outcome. Now, the second scenario, muddle through, is one where spending doesn't drop off a cliff, but just grows very slowly and gradually over time. Now, positive and negative economic forces might clash and just leave behind a stock market that's very volatile but makes little progress over time. Now, with all the challenges, it appears that a muddle through scenario is a much more likely outcome than Goldilocks. Now, three bears would be a scenario where spending just entirely falls off a cliff and we enter another bear market along the lines of that we experienced in 2000 or 2008. Now, while a three bears scenario is always hard to predict, significant economic imbalances have at least elevated the risk that we could experience another. And in economics, imbalances must be corrected. The question here is whether they're going to be corrected through strong growth, which would be consistent with a Goldilocks scenario, whether they'll be corrected very slowly over time, which would be the muddle through scenario, or whether they're going to be corrected through abrupt market adjustments, which would be the three bears. Now, often when I suggest to investors that Goldilocks shouldn't be entirely dismissed, they'll laugh. Yet their portfolios, when I look at them, remain invested as if it is the most likely outcome. They're doing the same things they always have because they or their advisor don't know what else to do. Now, this disturbs me to see people really rolling the dice with their future without even understanding the risks that they're taking. But there is a right way to react to changing seasons. So up to this point, I focused primarily on the big picture, but what is it that investors should do with this information? Well, adjustments to your investment approach can help you to combat some of the challenges I've discussed. So let me offer a little perspective on investment strategy. Now, investing can get pretty complicated in today's world with all the vehicles and strategies that are available. But when you strip away the fluff, there's really two primary investment options available. You can invest as an owner, which is what you're doing when you invest in stocks, or you can invest as a lender, which is what a bond investor is doing. Now, most people don't think of it this way, but investors taken together are the market and therefore must earn the returns of the market. For example, if the stock market returns 10%, some investors will earn more than 10% and some less, but on average they must earn 10%. Now, in a rising market, all investors can be winners. In my previous example, where I talked about the market going up 10%, even investors who don't earn 10 can still be profitable. However, what if the market returned 0% instead of 10? Well, in that case, the only way an investor can make money is at the expense of another investor who loses. So unless you believe that a Goldilocks scenario is in the cards, the only way to succeed is to be different than the market. So this means, for example, you should consider strategies that 1. Emphasize certain stocks or sectors over others. 2. Seek opportunities that don't entirely depend on rising stock and bond markets in order to succeed. And 3. Take profits more quickly and wait for new opportunities to arise, which will almost certainly be the case in volatile markets. Now, I want to be clear that I am not suggesting you abandon traditional stock and bond investments. I am only suggesting you reconsider the way you invest in them. Now, if you're using an advisor, don't assume that they understand the things I just explained to you. Advisors may have different opinions or different approaches to investing, but the opinions of advisors who have failed to do their homework should be dismissed. Now, I suggest you put your advisor to the test and ask them things like, how are corporate profits and GDP related? Or how will net exports impact economic growth? And I can assure you that most of you will be shocked by how little your advisor actually knows. Unfortunately, the advisory industry has been raised in a sales culture, and too many advisors don't have the knowledge or haven't taken the time to make these very important connections that we've discussed. And like them or not, do you want to put your financial future in the hands of an uninformed advisor? I think the answer is no.